Riley sat motionless in the pilot seat of the HH-60W Jolly Green 2, the canopy glass filtering the late afternoon light into a flat, metallic glare. Outside, the heat shimmered up from the tarmac in long, wavering lines. The refueling pad was quiet, except for the low murmur of background radio traffic bleeding through her headset. The crew chief had finished the post-flight checks 20 minutes earlier. Fuel topped off, avionics clean, rotors dormant, but she hadn't moved. Not yet. Her gloves hung loose from her belt, untouched. Her helmet sat on the console beside her, the chin strap twisted, still bearing the scuff from where it had bounced off the cargo ramp 2 months ago. That last mission had been clean on paper. Dust-off called, bird prepped, launch code cleared. But by the time they hit the ridge, comms were garbled and the fire team had already bled out. 3 lost. Riley had flown the same route back in silence. She hadn't spoken about it since. Now, a faint voice crackled through the ops frequency, blurred at the edges by static and distance. It was a relay from Ground Team Bravo. 4 personnel wounded, pinned behind rock on the south slope of Sector Echo. They'd popped smoke purple and were waiting for word. The call was short. A broken, breathless voice muttered something about visibility. Then silence. The ops controller's response came in clearer, sharper. Echo is red. Multiple confirmed threats in grid. No launch authorization. Hold air assets until further notice. Another voice followed, tight and clipped. Repeat. Red airspace. No launch. Riley reached forward and adjusted a single dial. Not because it needed adjustment, but because she couldn't sit still anymore. Her eyes tracked the shimmer rising from the flight line, then drifted toward the perimeter fence where 2 Blackhawks sat baking in the light. They weren't moving either. The co-pilot seat beside her remained empty. The others were in the briefing room, probably halfway through a dry sandwich and weather packet. She didn't need to hear the latest threat matrix to understand what red zone meant. She already knew what it felt like to arrive late. The HH-60W's interior carried the residue of use-dried grit in the corners, faded console labels, and a mission patch tucked under the dashboard glass. The patch had no unit number, just a stitched phrase. It read, quietly, in black-on-black thread, back before dark. She didn't remember who had left it there. The sky outside was flat and burning. Somewhere in the haze beyond the hills, purple smoke curled into that air. 4 people, still alive, had pulled the pins and waited. Riley hadn't seen their faces. She didn't need to. The image of the ones she hadn't reached was enough. Their outlines had never really left the inside of her canopy. The comms crackled again, but no new words followed. Just the hush of an open channel that no one had cut. Riley glanced once more at the fuel gauge, then at the horizon. She didn't check her watch. She didn't need a timestamp. What mattered was the window, and it was closing. Her hand hovered near the ignition switch but didn't move. Not yet. Somewhere behind her, the crew chief was walking back across the pad with a flight manifest tucked under one arm. The base operations building stood quiet, reflecting pale sky and long shadows. Riley exhaled through her nose, slow and even. Then she said it, under her breath but clear enough for the radio mic to pick up. They're still breathing. The tactical map glowed dull red beneath the overhead fluorescence. Thick zones had been marked across the grid with wide, transparent overlays. One of them centered over Sector Echo. An operations officer pointed with the edge of a capped pen, outlining the threat perimeter and the most recent satellite updates. Sniper activity confirmed on the North Ridge. No air cover in place. Sector remains red. No change in status. Riley stood off to the side, her flight gloves tucked into her belt, arms crossed without tension. The operations room was cool but stale, like every sealed briefing space forward of the line. Her crew was scattered across the back row, eyes shifting between the monitors and the paper notes handed out at the door. No one spoke. The analyst continued, not raising his voice. Fireteam Bravo lit smoke 35 minutes ago. Purple signal. Audio transmission confirms 4 personnel, all wounded. No KIA at last contact, but with no air clearance and Overwatch grounded due to visibility. That zone is a trap. We wait until green light. The younger co-pilot looked toward Riley without meaning to. His name was Trevor. He had flown 2 live missions. No one had yet needed to die in front of him. His voice barely carried when he asked, "Is anyone else spinning up?" The answer came not from Riley, but from the commander standing near the corner of the table. Negative. All rotary assets holding until confirmation of neutralized threat. He paused, glanced toward the status board, then added, "Might be extraction. Depends if we can clean the ridge." "Depends," someone repeated near the wall. It was barely audible. No one followed up. Riley moved without announcement. She walked out of the room, bypassing the wall-mounted comms panel and stepping into the flight prep corridor. The bay doors were propped open, heat pushing inward from the flight line. She didn't check the mission board. The checklists taped beside her aircraft's berth were still flapping in the air, current from the fans. One had her signature halfway down, paused mid-sequence. She hadn't finished it earlier. She didn't finish it now. The crew chief, Marquez, was already heading her way with the loadout sheet rolled in one hand. He didn't say anything. He just handed it over and began walking toward the aircraft without waiting for confirmation. He'd been flying long enough to understand when a mission existed outside the margins. Trevor appeared behind her, uncertain but still following. "They said it's red," he said. Riley didn't stop walking. "They did. We'll be out of support range the second we drop into the valley," he added, this time with more insistence. She reached the bird and began the walk around, trailing her hand along the skid mount, checking without pausing. "Then we won't stay long." The refueling crew saw them moving and began prepping the pit station. Someone jogged toward the hangar for the rest of the harness kit. No one asked for a manifest. Riley climbed into the cockpit without checking behind her. In the crew bay, Marquez adjusted the seating brackets to prep for casualty lift. He worked quietly. Riley could hear the click of the seat pins locking. Trevor climbed into the right seat beside her and pulled the door shut with a short, clipped motion. She powered up the avionics, hand steady on the master switch. The system came alive in a clean, familiar rhythm just like it had every time before. Warnings cleared one by one. Trevor spoke again, more quietly this time. "You sure they're still out there?" The instrument panel reflected back in her visor. She didn't look at him. "They threw smoke 35 minutes ago. That means they were still breathing." "They said wait for green." Riley adjusted the throttle. "Then they'll be late." Outside the bird, the crew had pulled clear. The rotors began to turn. The wash kicked up the corner of the flight tarp, sending it flapping against the hangar wall. Another helicopter stood idle 10 meters away, fully fueled, unmanned. The doors sealed. The comms snapped from base channel to open air. Riley leaned forward into her harness and watched the RPM rise toward takeoff threshold. The sound of the engines built in layered resonance. Low at first, then rising as the blades caught full torque. The ground blurred beneath them. Marquez sat in the rear bay and locked in the straps beside the ramp. He didn't speak. Neither did the gunner. There was nothing to ask. Riley lifted the bird into hover. The dust pulled outward in a widening circle. "They're still warm," she said, so low it barely registered in the mic. But Trevor heard her. So did the others. The HH-60W turned nose toward the canyon. The mission clock had not been started. It didn't matter. They were going in anyway. The canyon drew up around them like a stone throat, narrowing with every kilometer flown. Riley's hands stayed steady on the controls, fingertips resting on cyclic and throttle without tension. The HH-60W Jolly Green 2 cut low across the terrain, blades folding the air close enough to drag dust off the ridgelines. The terrain masking worked both ways. They couldn't see the snipers, but the snipers couldn't get full eyes on them either. Not yet. Inside the cockpit, the air was dry and loud, not from engine noise, but from the pressure of every system running at edge efficiency. The RPM held solid. The HUD blinked occasional caution prompts, rotor clearance, temperature fluctuation, one terrain proximity, Warning. She cleared without looking. Everything was within spec. But barely. The radio had gone quiet since they broke line with the forward base. No overwatch, no drones, no updates. Just the pulse of engine hum and the low tones of navigation relays feeding altitude and grid lines as they dropped deeper into the wash. Riley flew by visual edge and map memory. The fire team's last known position had been triangulated to a narrow basin with only one safe angle for ingress. She didn't mention it. The math was already done. A sudden pop echoed through the canyon, sharp, distant, but unmistakable. Trevor stiffened in the right seat, turning instinctively to scan the right side window. Riley didn't react. The sound had come from the far ridge, north slope, maybe 400 meters out and slightly above. Single shot. Too far to confirm. No follow-up. They pushed on. The bird shifted left as she took a longer bank around an exposed bend. Every new angle was a new risk. She knew that. So did the crew in the back. Neither Marquez nor the gunner spoke. They were listening to the same sound. She was the difference between echo and direction. As they rounded the last contour before the fire team's basin, the first round hit the windshield. It struck high, just above centerline, cracking outward in a spiderweb that distorted the sky through the laminate. The round didn't penetrate. A stress fracture rippled down toward the cockpit glare shield. The aircraft didn't shake. The instruments didn't jump. But Trevor's breath hitched in the headset channel. Riley said nothing. She tapped the side display once to reset the warning stack and kept the nose level. The gunner leaned out slightly, mounted behind the right door. "Ridge has glass on us," he said flatly. "Single point. No follow-up." "Distance?" Riley asked. "Too far for suppression. No eyes on exact." Riley gave the bird 1 degree of left yaw and dropped 3 meters lower. The walls of the canyon closed in tighter, and the light changed to a dull, amber haze. Ground altitude fed through in short bursts on the display. Margin shallow. She rode the line anyway. Then, finally, the signal. Purple smoke. It rose slowly at first, caught in a dead air pocket between outcroppings. Then the wind curled it sideways, dragging the plume into a short, vivid streak. It came from a basin no wider than a parking lot. No movement yet. Just the color. Smoke confirmed. Marquez called from the back. "That's them." Riley's eyes scanned the slope lines and the impact zones. "No terrain overhead," she said. "But we're landing blind. No cover." Marquez checked his gear. "Copy. Ramp on touch. I'll go." The basin floor was too narrow for full hoverhold. She would have to drop fast, flare late, and let the dust blind them. It wasn't ideal. It wasn't avoidable. Riley keyed into crew channel. "When we hit the wash, we land blind. You get out. You find them." Trevor opened his mouth, thought better of it, and closed it again. He started checking instruments more aggressively instead. Riley watched the RPM hold. Wind shift minor, visibility dropping. The HH-60W cleared the final ridge and rolled into descent. She nosed it down. Skids angled slightly to meet the rise in terrain. The smoke blew backward toward the bird, smearing across the windshield and disappearing into the fractured edge of the spider crack. The gunner dropped into position. Marquez shifted to the edge of the ramp, half crouched, harness rigged. The ground vanished in a sheet of dust. Visibility went to 0. They dropped into it anyway. The bird disappeared into brownout, rotor wash kicking up a full envelope of sand and grit that erased the canyon floor. There was no more terrain reference, no more visual lock, just feel. The altimeter rolled down. Riley adjusted torque by instinct. Her knuckles never whitened. Her breath never changed. 1 second passed, then 2, then 5. The HH-60W hovered 6 feet above the LZ. The ramp dropped. The only sound was the beat of the blades and the dust beating back against the fuselage. Riley waited. No one had eyes on the fire team yet. But they had landed. The moment the ramp hit dirt, the brownout swallowed everything. Dust poured into the cabin, curling up over the side panels and flooding across the floor. The bird hung steady, rotors pumping a roar into the tight canyon, the air vibrating with force and grit. Riley held the stick, low, heels flat, hands balanced, no visual, no terrain lock, just the instruments and the feel of weight distribution on the skids. Marquez dropped out first, vanished into the swirling haze. The gunner followed, barely visible even through the side window. Trevor tried to keep eyes on them through the forward panel, but it was useless. The dust closed in seconds. He shifted uncomfortably, checked altitude, and called the numbers out loud, not for protocol but to steady himself. Riley said nothing. A crack echoed down the canyon, sharp and flat. Another sniper round. It hit somewhere left of the nose, close enough to jolt the canopy. The fractured glass above Trevor's head stretched another inch across, still no breach. "Contact," he said, voice tight. "Left ridge. We are being ranged." Riley adjusted collective just enough to maintain hover, shifting torque to keep the nose aligned. She didn't flinch. "Ramp's still down," she said. "We hold." More dust entered, carrying grit and fragments of burned vegetation. The floor slicked with loose soil. A boot appeared at the edge of the ramp, dragging a limp body behind it. Marquez stumbled into the bay, face streaked with dirt, eyes narrowed to slits. He dropped to one knee, unhooked his harness, and pulled the first soldier inside. The man was unconscious. His uniform was torn at the leg and shoulder. His boots dragged across the ramp, heels leaving two faint lines behind him. Marquez pulled him clear and went back out without a word. Seconds passed. No voices on the crew channel. Just the pulse of the engine, the rattle of the airframe fighting lift, and the dust hammering against the skin of the bird. Trevor shifted again. "We've got to lift. Riley, we can't see anything." "We will when they're in." "They're calling our location," he snapped, pointing toward the front glass. "They have angle on us. If they line up the rotors." "Not yet." The second body came in rougher than the first. The gunner was half carrying, half dragging, the soldier's right arm limp and bloodied. One of the boots had come off. Marquez caught the other arm, and together they heaved him in. The soldier groaned once, then fell silent. The cabin stank of sweat, sand, and something else metallic and sharp. The gunner stayed inside this time, hands on the ramp latch. His face was pale under the dust. "Where's 4?" he asked. Marquez didn't answer. He turned and dropped back into the wash. Another shot rang out, closer. It struck the lower fuselage and echoed through the frame like a metal drum. Riley adjusted throttle again, brought the hover up half a foot. She didn't break contact with the controls. Every limb stayed exactly where it needed to be. Trevor hit the side panel with his palm. "This is it. We have to go. We're going to lose this bird. We're not done." "They're probably gone," he said, eyes wild now. "It's been too long." She didn't look at him. If they were gone, he wouldn't be out there. The third came in slowly. Marquez reappeared at the edge of the dust cloud, dragging a smaller figure across the slope. This one was barely conscious, boots scraping sideways, one leg limp. Riley could see it even through the grime streaked across the side window. The soldier's arm moved once. A weak push, like he was trying to help. Then it dropped again. Marquez hauled him in with both hands, breath heaving, sweat cutting lines through the grit on his face. The soldier fell across the threshold, blood soaking through his sleeve. His eyes opened for a moment, then closed. "Ramps clear," the gunner shouted. Riley didn't wait. She pulled the bird into lift, slow and deliberate. Dust chased them upward, then thinned as they cleared the basin. The canyon walls closed in fast. She angled left, banking tight to avoid the ridge. The tail rotor came within 2 meters of the cliff face. Trevor called it out without breathing. 2 meters. 1.5. 1. The bird cleared. Silence in the headset, then static, then command. "Rescue 2-6, you are not cleared to enter red zone. You are operating out of authority. Return to base immediately." Riley keyed the mic. "They're still breathing." The channel stayed quiet after that. She leveled the bird, nose forward, rotors clean. Below them, The canyon unspooled into open sky. Dust drifted behind them, marking the place where they had gone in and come back out. Inside the cabin, the bodies stayed motionless, but they were warm and alive. That was enough. The HH-60W sat motionless in the far corner of the hangar, blades secured, panels closed, and engines silent. Its windshield was still spidered from the impact, the cracks spreading in fine webs across the forward glass. Scorch marks blackened the left intake cowling. The lower fuselage bore a new dent just forward of the ramp, barely visible unless you were looking for it. Someone had already swept out the worst of the dust inside, but streaks of grit still clung to the cabin floor where blood had soaked in and dried. The interior held that faint, sharp smell of metal and hydraulic oil mixed with something harder to name. Riley stood 6 feet from the nose, helmet under one arm, flight gloves clipped back to her belt. Her boots left quiet prints on the concrete as she walked into the main office building. No one saluted. No one called her name. She passed through the corridor with the slow, steady pace of someone who had nothing left to explain. Inside the debriefing room, the lights were on but not harsh. 2 officers waited behind a plain table, both in pressed uniforms without dust or stain. One of them, a colonel, didn't look up from the paper he was reviewing as she entered. The other nodded once, gestured to the chair. Riley sat, posture relaxed, but attentive. The colonel finally looked at her. His voice was calm, even clipped. "Lieutenant Riley, your aircraft was observed entering restricted airspace without clearance. You landed inside a red zone during active threat status. That constitutes unauthorized deviation from standing orders." She said nothing. The other officer, a major, leaned forward. His tone stayed neutral. "We have reports of sniper activity logged during your insertion. Your crew recorded structural damage and exposed positioning under fire. Do you dispute any of that?" Riley met his eyes. "No, sir." The colonel continued. "You extracted 4 wounded personnel. We've confirmed their status through medical. 2 are stable. 2 are still under critical observation." Again, she said nothing. He tapped the sheet once, then folded it over. "We're not making a determination yet. There will be a review process, possibly a board. Until then, you're to remain on standby." Riley nodded once. The major paused before speaking again. "You made a choice, Lieutenant. One that exceeded your authority." Riley didn't shift in her seat. Her voice, when it came, was even. There was no one else coming. Neither man responded. The colonel closed the folder and set it aside. The session was over. Riley stood and exited without another word. Back outside, the sun had dropped closer to the horizon, casting long shadows across the flight line. She didn't return to the hangar. Instead, she walked the narrow gravel path past the medical tent, where the air conditioning units hummed against canvas walls. A field nurse stepped out, paused, and held the flap open for her. Riley didn't enter. Inside, arranged in a quiet row, were 4 gurneys. 3 were covered in light blankets, IVs running slow drips into each arm. The 4th held a soldier upright, propped at an angle, one shoulder bandaged and his other arm in a sling. His eyes were open. He looked at her. There was no smile, no salute, no words, just a small nod, a single, brief tilt of the head that said everything and nothing. She returned it, barely more than a blink, then turned and walked on. At the edge of the ramp, the crew chief stood beside a cart of tools, inspecting the HH-60W's rear panel for signs of fatigue. He didn't speak to her either. She stepped up to the aircraft, ran a hand along the edge of the access ladder, and looked once through the fractured windshield. The glass held the same damage it had when they landed. Not worse, not better. Just there. A mark of the thing they had done and survived. She climbed the ramp, stepped into the cabin, and crouched briefly beside the seat mount where one of the wounded had been laid. A stain had dried along the floor panel, dark and jagged, Someone had already tried to scrub it out. Not all of it had come clean. Riley unclipped her gloves from her belt and rested them on the seat for a moment, then picked them up again. There was no announcement, no crew gathering, no evaluation board pinned to the wall, just a cooling aircraft, a battered interior, and the certainty of 4 people still breathing. The cost wasn't listed anywhere. It didn't need to be. She stepped down from the bird, boots scraping the ramp edge, and walked back across the hangar floor as the light shifted 1 degree warmer and the silence held. The night had settled in thick and wide across the airfield, the kind of quiet that didn't come from silence but from distance. The hangars stood with their mouths open, lights dimmed to save power. Beyond the tarmac, a single medevac bird lifted off, rotors soft against the sky, its red beacon sweeping slowly across the horizon before fading behind the hills. The wind had calmed, leaving the ground still and warm underfoot. Riley sat on the rear ramp of the HH-60W, elbows resting loosely on her knees, gloves folded beside her. The bay doors remained open behind her, and the cabin lights had been switched off. Only the faint glow of the flight instruments still pulsed in the dark, left in standby mode. The tick of cooling metal came at uneven intervals, each one different from the last, like the aircraft was breathing out the last heat of the day. Her boots touched the edge of the ramp, heels angled downward toward the concrete. She didn't swing them, didn't move much at all. The back of her flight suit still bore the crease from the harness. She hadn't changed. Behind her, the cabin smelled like it always did after something hard cleaner. Oil, and a trace of sweat that no amount of scrubbing ever fully removed. Somewhere inside the hangar, someone was still working. A distant clang echoed once, then stopped. Nothing followed it. The footsteps came slowly, steady across the concrete. Riley didn't turn. She knew the sound. Marquez appeared just off her left shoulder, then eased himself down beside her without saying a word. He wore the same undershirt he'd been in all day, a stain on one sleeve and dust still clinging to the back collar. He looked out at the runway the same way she did, without urgency, without comment. Just there. A minute passed, then another. From the far end of the hangar, Trevor emerged carrying 2 paper cups. He walked with a slower pace than usual, not from fatigue exactly, but from something else measured, like he wasn't quite sure if he was interrupting. He offered one of the cups to Riley, then handed the other to Marquez, who took it without looking. The coffee steamed faintly in the cooling air. No one sipped it right away. Trevor sat cross-legged on the ramp, a few feet lower than the others. No one broke the quiet. The 3 of them faced the empty flight line like it held something worth watching. In a way, it did. The aircraft had been patched already. Maintenance crews had sealed the visible damage, refueled it, and logged it back into rotation. But the windshield hadn't been replaced. The spiderweb crack still held the same shape, reflecting the distant perimeter lights in thin, broken lines. The ramp hadn't been raised either. Riley hadn't told anyone to close it. Another bird lifted somewhere in the distance, farther off than the first. Its rotors beat a slower rhythm, heavier airframe, outbound run. The sound curved across the sky, then faded. Marquez finally spoke, voice low and even. They all make it. Riley nodded once, still breathing. He didn't answer, just shifted his boot slightly, the sole scraping softly against the ramp edge. Trevor turned his cup once in his hands before speaking. They'll ask again tomorrow. Probably, Riley said. You going to tell them anything different? No. Marquez chuckled once under his breath. Just a short sound. He took a slow sip from the cup and let the rest of the heat drift into the night. None of them moved to stand. The ramp stayed open, and the aircraft behind them stayed quiet, its internal lights casting just enough glow to outline the cabin. From the outside, the bird looked ready, not polished, not new, just waiting. The breeze picked up once more, faint enough to stir Riley's braid and rattle the edge of a tarp folded near the hangar wall. She didn't reach for it. She glanced at the sky. There were no stars that night, just a low, dull ceiling, and the occasional flicker of traffic lights far off where the valley opened again. She didn't think about the debrief. She didn't think about whether there would be a consequence. That part had already happened. The decision wasn't part of some rebellion. It had simply been necessary. 4 people were alive. She had flown out and come back with them. That was the job. Or at least, it used to be. The coffee cooled in her hand. She didn't finish it. Trevor leaned back and rested his shoulders against the ramp edge. Think it'll get quieter out here. Riley didn't answer right away. She looked toward the hills, past where the last plume of medevac dust had settled, and finally spoke. She'd do it again, because the smoke hadn't stopped burning. Riley's story is not about medals or headlines. It is about the quiet weight of responsibility carried without recognition. She flew, not because she was told to, but because someone had to. Through grit, dust, and silence. She chose presence over permission and brought them home. No one cheered. No one needed to. Her strength was never in the noise, but in the stillness she held when everything else shook. This story is for those who lead from the back, who act without applause, who measure worth not by credit, but by courage. If Riley's resolve stayed with you, take a moment to reflect. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this quiet, grounded, and true, follow along. Sometimes the strongest voices are the ones that never need to raise themselves.